prompt you that it's recording. So welcome everybody. I'm excited to now that we have gotten 1 week under our belts where I did most of the talking, and I apologize for that. Now I hope that you all have gotten yourselves involved in this book and are going to be able to make some comments and ask some questions and refer to some things that are in the book. It's nice to see everybody. I know that there are a couple of people watching from far away and places like North Carolina and California, where the weather must be better than it is here in Connecticut. The last couple of days have been a little rough, but spring is coming. I can feel it. I can see it. It's on its way. I'm going to start today with a brief recording of something I showed to the student body at Hotchkiss just yesterday. Tonight at Hotchkiss, where I teach, we are holding a meeting. We did one in the immediate aftermath of the invasion back at the end of February. And now we're going to do another one tonight just to give the students an opportunity to talk about what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in their lives. We have at Hotchkiss 7 students who have family either in Russia or in Ukraine. And so we are particularly sensitive to them and how this experience is playing out for them. We also have a number of students from Europe in general, German students, Czech students, French students, Polish students, and they have, all those countries, of course, are feeling the ramifications of what's going on. I have a friend in Ukraine. I'm going to give you just a brief, just a little brief background of him. Relatively young man, he's about 35 years old, who is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. He is Ukrainian, but a Russian speaker. And he and I have been in touch every day for the last month, just to see how things are going. He is a husband, a father of 2 young girls, 7 and 3. They have moved to Germany now. He took them to the border where they got on a train and went to Germany. The wife and the 2 little girls are fine. They're living in an apartment that the German, I don't know if it was the German government or if it was some charity organization, but they set them up with an apartment. Nothing in the apartment at all, no furniture, no beds, no dishes, no glasses, anything like that. So they've been scrambling a little bit to sort of get their lives set up. But they're there, and my friend Yevgeny Zhenya, who you'll see in just a minute, is back in Ukraine. He's with his the parents of his wife, who are probably in their late 50s, and they've been traveling around Ukraine, just trying to keep themselves out of trouble. Zhenya and his family lived in Kyiv before the invasion. They left Kyiv on the 25th of February. We've had the pleasure, if that's the right word, to meet with, Zhenya has zoomed into my Russian history classes here at Hotchkiss a couple of times. Once the day before the invasion, he was very relaxed about it all, didn't think there was going to be any problem. The day that we talked to him, he was picking his daughter up from her gymnastics class, and it was all quite calm. The next time we spoke to him about 6 days later, there was a significant difference in, well, everything about it was different. He was in hiding. His wife and kids were still with him, but they were making their way to the border, and it was a much more sobering conversation. But I'm going to show you this quick video, and it might take me a second to grab it. I thought I had it ready to go. Something mysterious that happens sometimes when I open Zoom, and everything that I thought I had my hands on is suddenly missing. Give me just one moment.
Hi, Keith.
Hi.
I couldn't get on, but now I'm on Blackboard.
Okay.
Yep.
I hope you can see it.
On my little phone.
That's great.
Yeah.
Sorry, everybody. Give me one moment. I'm having a little trouble getting what I want to show you.
Okay, let's leave this and go to.
Rosina, mute yourself.
Okay.
I apologize, everybody. I had this set and it didn't Shouldn't hold
I
it.
don't even know how to mute myself on my phone. Hold on. How do I mute on the phone, Patty?
Here, Rosina, I think I can get it.
Rosina, go to the bottom of your screen and just hit it with your finger and you'll see the line come up that shows you the Okay, video. got it. Okay?
Okay, one more second, everybody, and I've got this ready to go now. I apologize. So this is Zhenya in his own words. It's about a 2-minute video, and it is subtitled in English. He is speaking in Russian, but it's subtitled in English.
Здравствуйте, Хачкис.
Oh, all of a sudden I realized that maybe could you all see those subtitles?
No.
No, this.
No.
No.
Let me make this smaller and then we should be able to see it. Okay, let's try that. Try it again and we can just, I think we'll be able to see it. Won't see his face quite as well, but that's okay.
Здравствуйте, Хачкис. Меня зовут Женя, я из Украины. На данный момент моя семья находится в Германии. То есть из-за ситуации в нашей стране, а именно это война, мне пришлось отправить свою жену, 2 детей в Германию. На данный момент забрал из Киева родителей своей жены. И мы сейчас проживаем в Западной Украине, в городе Ивано-Франковск. Вместе я, мама моей жены, папа моей жены, несколько наших друзей. Мы проживаем на данный момент, как я уже говорил, в Ивано-Франковске. Все без работы, потому что в стране у нас война идет. Каждый день, 5 раз в день срабатывает воздушная сирена, тревога, потому что русские самолеты и артиллерия, они прилетают к нам сюда, даже на Западную Украину. В данный момент в нашем городе более или менее спокойно, ничего не взрывается. Но благодаря вам мы хоть как-то здесь справляемся, благодаря помощи наших западных друзей и партнеров, как говорится. Ну и мы, конечно, стараемся здесь помогать нашим военным. Вот. Хочу вам сказать большое спасибо. Thank you very much. Everybody who help us. And God bless us. Thank you.
So I don't ever want to forget what it is that's happening in this war. I think we've all seen it over the course of the last month, that these are real people whose lives are being upended and affected. Ukraine, just for the record, is a country, at least before the invasion, a country of 44 million people. That's more people than live in the states of Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey combined. It's about 6 million more people than live in Canada. And about 10% of the population at this point has either fled from Ukraine or been killed. These are terrible numbers and terrible. It's a terrible thing that is happening without question on the humanitarian level. And we're going to be dealing with the repercussions of this for years, if not decades to come. But let me pause there for a minute and see if anybody has any comment or any reaction, any reflection on what we just watched.
I have a question,
Mhm.
Keith. He said he wasn't anticipating a war, and a lot of people were not anticipating a war, but it seems to me the Ukrainian military was definitely anticipating a war because of the way they've responded in the last month. Yeah,
I think that's I mean, I'm glad of that. I'm glad that the military had some preparation and anticipation that this could go wrong. In my opinion, and I think as we get deeper into this book, we'll see that Vladimir Putin's really been telegraphing this for years, certainly the last 8 years since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. There's been really no question that that Putin has had his eyes on other parts of Ukraine. There's been a not so quiet war, I suppose, if that's where you live, but kind of a quiet war on the national and international news level happening in eastern Ukraine for the better part of the last 10 years. It's been quite a bloody war, actually. The Donbass region, which we hear about from time to time, this region that Putin is particularly interested in, ethnically Russian more than ethnically Ukrainian, is something that he's had his eye on for a very long time. There's also the land bridge that connects Crimea to the rest of Russia. He's been quite interested in the eastern parts of the country. So there's been fighting there really relentlessly, although on a relatively small scale compared to what we're seeing right now, for the last 10 years. So I think the Ukrainian military was smart to be prepared and ready. I think the political messaging that was going out from, if you remember just before the war, President Zelensky had repeatedly said that the United States and the West was maybe making too much of a big deal out of this, and that he didn't anticipate that Russia would actually invade. I think that's the message that someone like Zhenya probably received and thought, we're okay. I think it was hard to imagine. I remember feeling this way myself. It was hard to imagine that we were actually going to see war break out between these two countries in the 21st century. That just seemed implausible. But of course, looking back on it, it was both plausible and quite predictable. So I think maybe it's we were all a little bit naive and all a little bit eager to believe in the right course, and Mr. Putin has taken us down a quite different course.
Well, why do you think he waited 8 years from the time when he annexed, the other or the other in the Black Sea there? What took him 8 years? Was he trying to just rebuild his military, or what do you think?
I think for a couple of things. One, I think he has spent most of the last 8 years building up that fund that he has, that basically they've been stashing away billions and billions and billions of dollars to with the idea that they could overcome any sanctions that the West put on them. The West put on more significant sanctions in 2014 than he anticipated. And I think he realized that the crisis, the economic crisis that caused inside Russia scared him a little bit. And he started to build up this just enormous mountain of reserves, of money reserves, gold reserves, all kinds of instruments of value.
But he could hold on to the gold reserves, but what they did is they froze the assets of the Russian central bank,
Yep.
which was invested in foreign currencies and
Yep.
instruments. I mean, and it's quite a few $100 billion.
Yep.
I think I read that it was 600 billion or something.
I think that's right. I think that was the money that he was counting on. I think he thought he was ready now, financially ready, economically ready to go in and fight this war. I think he underestimated the response by the West in terms of sanctions. I think it's
That's
also
a huge miscalculation.
It's a big miscalculation. I don't know that, and even if he'd had all that money, I'm not sure this would have been the way to go. I think he miscalculated on a number of fronts. At the same time, I think he's also, one of the things that we learned about him in this first reading is he's a fairly impulsive character. He's a risk taker. He believes in when opportunity presents itself, he should take it. And I think maybe because of COVID, certainly the world has been distracted the last 2 years by lots and lots and lots of other things to worry about, I think he decided that this was as good a time as any to make his move. I personally think he had it in mind that May 9th is an exceptionally important date on the Russian calendar, because that's their victory in Europe day. That's the end of the Second World War. In Russia, that's when it's celebrated. In the United States, we call VE Day May 8th, but the Russians did not receive their surrender from the Nazis until the 9th. So they celebrated on that day. I think he wanted to fight this war in February, get it all tidied up in March and April, and then have that be part of the grand celebration in May. He underestimated what this was going to look like. And I think the jury's still out on what it will look like. I don't believe, I have to say for a minute, that what the Russians are doing is backing off. I think what we're witnessing right now is that they're, if anything, they're reloading. And I think what we're going to get next might be even uglier, but we'll see. I do think he has tested the world a number of times. In 2008, he was really buoyed by what happened in Georgia, the small war. We'll read about that in about 2 weeks, the small war in Georgia. In 2014, the annexation of Crimea cost him some money, but it didn't cost him a whole lot else. And he was able to continue on and be successful. And then in 2015, 2016 in Syria, the world seemed not to, I mean, we were unwilling to really fight him on some key moments in Syria. So what we see, I think, is a man who feels emboldened by his own past history as president.
Yeah, the Crimea is primarily made up of Russian-speaking people. Is that?
It is. Crimea is a funny. Crimea has been used, just to give a little bit of background history. Peter the Great is the first Russian czar at the end of the 17th century, the beginning of the 18th century, to really move south and challenge the Turks for control of the Black Sea. So he rather famously defeated the Turks and ultimately gained a foothold at the Sea of Azov. We're reading about cities like Mariupol a lot, and they are in that area. If you look at the map of Ukraine, the Sea of Azov is the little small sea sort of to the north east of the bigger Black Sea. And moving from there through the 18th century, it's really Catherine the Great at the end of the 18th century who wins Crimea, wins that northern coast of the Black Sea for Russia. There's fighting over Crimea for centuries to come. There was a Crimean War in the 1850s that is really a battle ostensibly between the Turks and the Russians, but the British get involved, the French get involved. It's a little bit of a preview to what we'll see later on in the later wars of the 19th and 20th centuries. So it's because it's a peninsula, because it juts out into the Black Sea, and the Black Sea opens ultimately into the Mediterranean, which opens ultimately into the Atlantic Ocean. This is considered a strategically crucial place for Russia. And most of the Soviet Navy, back when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Navy bases were in Crimea, or the major ones, sort of like in the United States, Virginia Beach or Norfolk or San Diego, something like that. These really crucial major naval bases and naval cities. So the idea of losing Crimea, which was populated by mostly ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people, was not. I don't want to give Mr. Putin any credibility on this because I think he's wrong, but he was making the argument that those were really Russian lands, and they held a referendum. It was a referendum of quite dubious legality, but they held a referendum and the vote was overwhelming that Crimea wanted to rejoin Russia. So that's where we sit, where we have sat since 2014. If you look at a map of Russia printed by the Russians, Crimea is the same color as the rest of Russia. If you look at any map published in the West, you will see that Crimea still appears as part of Ukraine. So this is disputed land. The Ukrainians completely believe that Crimea belongs to them and would like it back. The Russians don't see it that way. And as a matter of power, there's not much that Ukraine can do to reclaim Crimea. But as of right now, from the Russian perspective, it's certainly viewed as part of Russia. These other places to the east, in the eastern provinces of Ukraine, are still being fought over. They're not, I don't think anybody, including the Russians, would consider them Russian, these two enclaves that Russia declared independent or sovereign nations, or whatever that statement was at the end of February. They are kind of no man's land right now. The Ukrainians still believe wholeheartedly that they belong to Ukraine. Russia does not say that they are part of Russia yet, but I think that's ultimately what Putin will try to do. I'm going to take us back. I appreciate that question, and of course, the current state of affairs is something that we want to keep thinking about. I want to take us back a little bit to. We're going to talk a little bit about Mikhail Gorbachev. I promised that last week, and we didn't really do it. And I want to talk about the end of the Soviet Union. I want to show another short video. This one is from something called 100 Minutes of Russian History on YouTube. It's just about a 3-minute clip, and it's going to take us through the period. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 as the general secretary of the Communist Party. He was young. It came on the heels of 3 quite old and not particularly strong leaders that immediately preceded him. Leonid Brezhnev had been general secretary from 1964 to 1982. Then briefly from 1982 to 1984, Yuri Andropov, who has already appeared in our book, has featured in our book, the former head of the KGB, took over as general secretary for about 1.5 years until he died. Brezhnev died in 82, Andropov died in 84. And then Konstantin Chernenko, who was really well past his prime, took over for about 1 year and until he died in 1985. 1985, the decision was made, and I know most of you remember this, to go with a much younger man. Mikhail Gorbachev at the time, I think, was 49 years old and considered part of a youth brigade that was making its way up through the Kremlin, and the government recognizing that it was in some trouble if it didn't find somebody to run the country that had more youth and vigor, they turned to him. He put into place 2 sort of paired movements, 2 policies that ultimately within the next 6 years would lead, not intentionally, but they would lead to the demise of the Soviet Union. One of them, the Russian word perestroika, which really means restructuring, and the other glasnost, which means openness or giving voice to things. The idea was with glasnost was he was going to allow more free speech, more publication of books and periodicals, and just simply allow more constructive criticism to be expressed in the Soviet Union than had been expressed before, and that this would ultimately lead to a greater understanding of the problems within the Soviet Union and therefore help him with this economic restructuring, this perestroika that he wanted to put at the forefront of his presidential policies. Ultimately, it didn't, as I say, it didn't work. He unleashed a Pandora's box of trouble and wanted the constructive criticism to come out, all of the criticism came out, and that ultimately became a real problem for the country. By 1991, we'll see that Gorbachev falters. There is a coup attempt against him, a sort of right wing, which is an odd way to talk about hardline communists. We usually think of on the left, but this a very conservative group of communists who wanted to take the country back to what it had been, tried to take over. There were eight conspirators in that, including Gorbachev's vice president and the minister of the head of the KGB, the minister of defense. A number of very strong cabinet members tried to overthrow Gorbachev. That failed. Gorbachev came back. He was under house arrest for about 3 days. They liberated him and he returned. But by that point, Boris Yeltsin, who had been elected the year before as the president of Russia, which was part of the Soviet Union, so there was no independent status for Russia. He had been elected to a position that really didn't have much meaning, but now he had become the real political heart and soul of Russia. And so when Gorbachev came back, it was Boris Yeltsin who had stood in front of the crowds in Moscow and exhorted them to stay on the streets, don't give in, don't go back to communism, don't allow this sort of shady group of 8 to take over. He was the real hero of the moment. And it wasn't long before Gorbachev, by December of 1991, Gorbachev resigned, and upon his resignation also dissolved the Soviet Union, thus creating 15 independent nations, including the nation of Ukraine. So this 1991 year, this moment, is really crucial, I think, in understanding the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. It's also crucial in understanding where Vladimir Putin comes from. As we know from the book, by this point in the 1980s and early 1990s, Putin was a KGB officer and was living most of his life in East Germany, which by 1991 no longer existed either. East and West Germany, when the wall came down at the end of 1989, the reunification of Germany in 1990 meant that there was no more East Germany as Putin had understood it all of his life. So let me show you this video real quick, and then we can talk about that a little bit. And I apologize, I might have to do the same thing I did before for a moment. Meanwhile, while I'm working on that, does anybody have any comments about anything I just said? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak if you do.
I have a question, Keith.
Sure.
How have your Russian students reacted to what's been going on?
Well, it's certainly been difficult for them. We have 3 students whose families were, until quite recently, living in Russia. So we have 3 students whose home is in Moscow or nearby. They on a personal level have had a terrible month, of course. They've been very concerned about their own families, the economic situation, really quite routine and simple things that we think about, using credit cards, these kids paying their tuition, that kind of thing has suddenly become very problematic because these sanctions that have been imposed on Russia have affected anybody who lives in Russia. And so they've been cut off from, not cut off from their families. I'm intrigued by this because I have not had much trouble communicating with Russians via social media. All the talk about Facebook being shut down and all these other social media outlets being shut down, I've not found that. It's not been difficult to communicate back and forth with Russians for me. And I think the same is true for these kids. Some of their families have left. I think they're in different situations and are trying to make their way out of the country so that they can continue to do what they've been doing, which is send their kids abroad to go to school. We also have some I don't think we don't have any Ukrainian students or students who live in Ukraine as their primary residence right now, but we have several kids who have grandparents or aunts and uncles who live in Ukraine. So that's been, of course, something that we've been monitoring and trying to track. They're all very sad, I think, on both sides. The Russian kids are just as sad as the Ukrainian kids. This is a difficult situation for everybody. Nobody wants this war, I have to say. Let me share my screen. Let's watch this. And I apologize. Right at the beginning, there's kind of it's going to be a little noisy for a minute, but then it'll settle down. A lot of images coming at you fast and furious right here at the beginning. That will settle down too.
History of Russia in 100 Minutes by Smart Histories. Gorbachev's Perestroika. When Mikhail Gorbachev assumed power in 1985, his goal was to bring the Soviet Union out of its economic and political deadlock while still preserving socialism. Instead, he unintentionally ignited the process that led to the collapse of the whole Soviet system. Background: Mikhail Gorbachev was only 54 when he was elected General Secretary in March 1985. He brought fresh air and new thinking to the party. Perestroika and glasnost. The Soviet model of a planned economy had completely fallen into crisis, and Gorbachev was determined to launch large-scale reform campaigns. Perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Foreign policy. New economic reforms demanded funds, and Russia could no longer keep up with the United States in the global arms race. Gorbachev proposed to end the arms race and establish warmer diplomatic relations. For this, he repeatedly met with President Ronald Reagan, and relations did, indeed, relax. He ended the Afghan War and began pulling Soviet troops out of Eastern Europe. On the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall was taken down by the public during a mass demonstration. Meanwhile, other Eastern Bloc states also became democracies, which Gorbachev could not help but accept. Political reforms. In 1989, Gorbachev's reforms introduced presidential power and the first free elections in Russia in 72 years. The newly elected Congress of People's Deputies assembled for the first time on the 25th of May 1989. Rebellions. But Gorbachev's economic reforms did not work, and the living standard of people worsened. In many Soviet republics, the struggle for autonomy and then for independence gathered momentum. Moscow sent tanks to put down popular movements, but it was already too late. It became more and more evident that the Soviet Union was in itself a relic of the past. Gorbachev was juggling between the reformists and the reactionaries, and he was preparing the new Union Treaty to save the empire. Meanwhile, the importance of the Russian Soviet Federative Republic and its president, Boris Yeltsin, was growing. Collapse of the Soviet Union. On the 19th of August 1991, the August Putsch began. The reactionary group, led by Vladimir Krichkov, Dmitry Yazov, and Gennady Yonayev, locked Gorbachev in his Crimean estate and tried to establish power under the State Committee on the State of Emergency. Tanks were sent to Moscow, but people blocked their way, and Boris Yeltsin took control. On his return, Gorbachev lost most of his authority to Yeltsin. On the 8th of December 1991, Boris Yeltsin, Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich of Belarus signed the creation treaty of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, without informing Gorbachev beforehand. The Soviet Union was officially dissolved on the 26th of December 1991. Thank you for watching. Thousands of helpful resources of Russian history. Please visit our website, Smart Histories. History of Russia in 100 Minutes.
Technology. So that I hope gave us some visual images to think about, along with the story of what was happening there between 1985 and 1991. Any comments on any of that? I imagine most of you remember, at least in maybe not with so many details, but remember the period of time we're talking about.
Keith?
Yeah.
There is an article in today's Lakeville Journal, Why Does Russia Want Ukraine? From somebody who is from Macedonia called Dalibor Anchovsky. Have you ever heard of him?
I have not, no.
He wrote this letter and said, why does Russia want Ukraine? And he lists a number of things, such as growing wheat and their connections with various gas lines and other things going on. So it's quite interesting, and it gives an explanation as to why they want it back.
Yep. In today's New York Times, Brett Stevens has a piece about what he thinks Putin's interests in Ukraine are. Of course, there are very significant agricultural interests that Ukraine produces a lot of wheat. The United Nations is forecasting a real problem in the coming months because there is no agricultural production happening or planting happening right now in Ukraine. It just can't. And what that will mean in 5 months' time, 6 months' time is frightening. And also the natural gas. There's a tremendous amount of natural gas in the eastern part of Ukraine, which again, I think those are the principal areas that Putin is most interested in. The wheat, actually, I don't know enough about agriculture or the agricultural parts of Ukraine to know for sure where the wheat is grown, but I suspect I'll leave it there. I'll try to find that out. I don't know enough about their growing areas. Certainly, the natural gas is of great interest to Putin. He sees himself as the king, the emperor of this growing natural resource kingdom, and particularly fossil fuel kingdom that he runs. And he knows that Europe depends on Russian oil and gas. China depends on Russian oil and gas. Lots of countries like India, Pakistan, they rely on Russian oil and gas. And he knows that even if he's misbehaving in the world, sooner or later, the world is going to come back to him because they need what he's got.
The one thing the Chinese, who are quite clever about how they go about this, they're not going all in on Russian oil and gas. They're keeping their trade lines open with the Middle East because they do not want to become dependent like Europe did on Russian oil and gas. And it's true to some extent with India. Don't forget where the Middle East is and where all the trade lanes are. So those countries you mentioned take a substantial amount of their oil and natural gas from the Middle East, so that Russia is a player in those markets, but it's not the dominant player. Rather, the Middle Eastern oil producing, gas producing countries are.
I do worry a little bit about, we've seen this, but we saw this before in 2014 when the European Union and the United States put sanctions on Russia and prevented stopped buying as much oil and gas from Russia as they had. The Chinese were very quick to jump in. They got some great deals, actually. Russia was going to build a pipeline that was going to bring in something like $600 billion over X number of years. And the Chinese signed a deal when Russia was a little more desperate to bring in the same amount of oil and gas for something like 30% less money. So they're in a position, the Indians also, to be pretty opportunistic. If Russia gets desperate, it may have to sell its oil and gas at lower rates. And they will take advantage of that. I don't know what to say about that beyond that. This is something that we have to continue to watch and we'll see what happens. But they have not been willing to date to say that they will simply stop. It was tough to get the Europeans to make any move on this. The United States itself was not quite willing at the very beginning of the war to say that they wouldn't buy oil and gas from Russia. So these are real factors, economic factors. We all have, we all know what the price of gas is right now, and these are realities that countries have to take into account ultimately. I want to go back to Gorbachev here for a minute and just think about what we learned about Putin in his early years, and just any thoughts about things you read or questions about the reading. We read up to page 51, basically this period, this Gorbachev period. And Natalia, go ahead. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yes, hi. This video that you showed brought me back to 1980s. So I was a young student back at the university, and I remember those leaders just keep dying every year. And so first Brezhnev died, we were really stunned, because all our life he was the general secretary. So it was really somber, like we had like some kind of event at the university, to kind of reflect. But then they start really dying every year, and we as a student, young people, we're like, all right, it was not important anymore. Okay, the new one. So then when the Gorbachev was, it was really, and you saw in the young people's faces, it was really, we thought it was really great. He was young, he had new ideas. So we were all excited, very excited about him. So just from my, again, young person perspective, he, though, did one thing that we all didn't like, which is he was fighting the alcoholism problem, I guess. So he really restricted the sale of alcohol before a certain time. And like, so it was really kind of dramatic for Russians. So he also did a lot of wine producing farms destruction in Armenia and Georgia and the south of the Soviet Union. So that was kind of a devastation to them, to the farmers, but in general to the whole market of, say, alcohol. And so it's just interesting. Thank you for showing. It's really cool.
We had a chance with this class. Some of you took a class with me 3 years ago now, I think, on Gorbachev. We read a biography of Gorbachev, a brave man, a fascinating man, ultimately a failure in terms of his work as president, and one of the most reviled men certainly in the 1990s and the early 2000s inside of Russia. In the West, I think he's generally seen as somebody who tried his best and had some good initiatives and ideas. Inside Russia, he's seen as the father of the disaster, the economic disaster, depression that affected Russia through the 1990s. What's stunning to me, just amazing, is that Gorbachev is still alive. I had his age wrong. The video got it right. He was 54 in 1985, which means that he's 91, I think, and is still alive. That it seems like almost a ghost from the long ago past, because he hasn't been in power in over 30 years. But that's just interesting. He's had some very critical things to say about Putin along the way. Sometimes some positive things to say about him, especially at the beginning of Putin's run in the 2000s, but more recently, fairly negative. Nina, please go ahead.
Two things. One, Gorbachev's daughter, Nina, is writing quite a bit on what's happening and being interviewed. If anybody sees her, she teaches here in the US at this point, which I find fascinating. But you were asking about our reaction to Putin, and I must say that in reading about his early life, I was surprised. I guess I just always thought of him as KGB. I never thought of him as what I now do, which is a spoiled, coddled child. And that child got away with whatever he wanted to do and was fawned over by his parents. And you see it. You see it in the person he's become. So anyway, to me, it was really fascinating. I had such a strong opinion, and that when I found that there were different building blocks to who the man has become, it was really fascinating.
Yeah. Natalia, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for bringing the early years. So I also didn't know before reading this book, this first 50 pages, of what was his parents like and grandparents. And so it struck me that I also grew up in St. Petersburg. I'm a little bit younger than him, but still, we in Leningrad. So we really were taught from the first grade on about the siege of Leningrad. We were going on a field trip every year to the Museum of Siege of Leningrad. And so it's very strange to me that the person who really, the siege and the war and the trouble and horror that it afflicted on Leningrad, especially, and therefore his parents, and this person now doing the wars. Like it's just inconceivable, because all Leningrad people, we with mother's milk, it was just the war is bad, it's horrible, a lot of death and destruction, so we don't want war. So I was just really stunned that that was his upbringing too, and that's what he had become.
Let me give just a little bit of context here. Natalia's raised some, and Nina too, some really important things that come up in the book and maybe are worth just a little bit of explanation. The city of St. Petersburg was founded in 1703, is when Peter the Great famously is said to have slapped his fist down into the mud and said, here is where we will build my city. The capital of the country was Moscow. St. Petersburg was a swampland up near what was at the time the Swedish border, and he wanted a seaside city that was going to be a window to the West. It was going to be this great opportunity to build out Russia's navy and to be a European power in a way that Russia to that point had not really been. So from the early part of the 18th century until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the city of St. Petersburg became the capital, the imperial capital of Russia. For 200 years, that's where the Tsar lived. Interestingly, Tsars continued to be crowned in Moscow, even after St. Petersburg was created, though they were buried in St. Petersburg. Just an interesting side note. During the First World War, sometimes it gets a little confusing, because during the First World War, in an effort to de-Germanify the name of the capital city, they changed it to Petrograd, making it sound more Russian. Same city, St. Petersburg and Petrograd are the same place, but often if you're reading about the Russian Revolution or the First World War, you will see the name Petrograd with frequency. And then after Lenin, who led the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, after he died in 1924, the decision was made to rename the city for him. So the city, St. Petersburg, became Petrograd, became Leningrad, and now is St. Petersburg again, and has been since 1991. But when we talk about the siege of Leningrad, for example, that is the city of St. Petersburg. And at the turn of the century, the 1900, it was the largest city in Russia. Now it is still the second largest city in Russia. Moscow is first, St. Petersburg is second. So the siege of Leningrad takes place during the Second World War. The Nazis tried to, they invaded in June of 1941. They encircled the city of Leningrad. They intended, Hitler even sent out invitations to the victory party he was going to have at the Astoria Hotel in downtown Leningrad. And but the Soviets fought him for well over 2.5 years. Probably the best book on this subject, written by Harrison Salisbury, called 900 Days. Harrison Salisbury, who lived right here in Salisbury, and worked for the New York Times, was a correspondent for them, and a quite renowned writer. That book chronicles this horrifying 2.5 years of starvation, of bombing, of theft. The Nazis, as wherever the Nazis did make it on the borders of Leningrad, they stole everything they could get their hands on, and just a brutal, brutal battle. But Leningrad never fell. It never gave in to the Nazis. Over 1 million people died in a city of about 2.2 million, so almost half the people died. Really a radically terrible time. The city of St. Petersburg did not regain its pre-war population for another 20 years. Just quite sad and quite amazing. So it is striking, I think, what Natalia's getting at. This son of Leningrad grew up there, made his name there. That he is besieging cities in Ukraine is really pretty horrifying. The other thing that struck me, I don't know if it caught anybody else's attention, he honeymooned in Ukraine. Here is this, presumably one of the happiest times of his life, although it didn't sound like the marriage was particularly happy. But that's where he spent his honeymoon. And this is disturbing too. I'm going to show you another video clip. This one has no words. I think maybe 2 months ago, I would have seen some humor in this. No longer think there's anything about Mr. Putin that's particularly funny. But I think you'll find it interesting in the way that I did. We're going to watch Mr. Putin grow up here. Bear with me just for a second. Best laid plans. I had all these things set up, ready to go, and as soon as I turned on Zoom, strange things started to happen. All right, give me just one moment and I'll get this on your screen. This video, I think, takes about 2.5 minutes. And I think you'll see that as soon as I put it up, what it's going to do. Any comments about that?
I agree with Biden. There is no soul on the other side of those eyes.
He seems to like animals. He smiles quite nicely with animals, but you got to be careful of some people in history who liked animals. You know, one of the more interesting things is how he created the oligarchs. I don't know if this is the appropriate time to say something, but I have some personal knowledge of some oligarchs. I worked with my partner representing a company called Severstall Steel. And the oligarch was Alexei Mordashov. And we were always wondering how Alexei got all his money. And what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, they gave all the workers script to, to own the companies. It was handed out, but the script, they had no food, nothing. I mean, the script was worthless. So what happened was Putin, because the secret services, had access to money, they lent certain guys, in this case, Mordashov was a bookkeeper at Severstall Steel, but he was a smart guy, and he got money from this dark source, and he bought out all the workers at pennies on the dollar and became the biggest owner of Severstall Steel, having the majority of that. And so we represented Severstall when they bought, and it was a big deal because of the symbolism. Henry Ford had created a steel company in the 1920s called River Rouge Steel. And Severstall bought River Rouge. And here was Russians buying one of the, basic companies of capitalism. And he also tried to buy, Mordashov meaning, he wanted to buy Bethlehem Steel. So we had to go to Moscow, and he had to get permission from Putin, because in essence, it became very clear that although he was the CEO of the company, he had to go to Putin and make sure that he had permission to go bid for, which he must have done for River Rouge, but it wasn't as obvious. So we spent days hanging around Moscow, waiting for him to get permission. And Putin, there was reluctance because he didn't want to have too much money invested in the United States. But this guy Mordashov, like a lot of those people in the basic industries, they became beholden to him because he gave them the money to create what they created. So
thank you. Let me jump in here just because we're going to run out of time in just a minute. But the next chapters of the book, I think what's interesting to look at, what we've seen in the book so far is Vladimir Putin through 1989. 1989, 1990, 1991. These are critical years in Russia in terms of change, the transformation from the old system. I think what Natalia was describing in her own childhood and adolescence to a much newer Russia. All things seemed possible at the time, and then as it turned out, there were a lot of fault lines that nobody had really anticipated, and things became much more problematic than they expected. Those are the years that we're about to read in this book. So here is this man, Vladimir Putin, who had come of age, started working for the KGB, went through the university, started working for the KGB, got married, all of this in what I would call the old Soviet Union, the old system, very, very much anticipating that his whole life really would be spent working in a system that he grew up understanding. That is going to radically transform itself here in the next, whatever we're reading, 60, 80 pages for next week. And we're going to witness the 1990s, which are a chaotic, wild ride. It's not a good scene in Russia. Boris Yeltsin comes to power in 1991. He is a brave man in 1991. He didn't know what he was doing. in terms of transforming a country into a brand new economy. The 14 separate republics go on their merry way away from the Soviet center, Russia. That's problematic for them. There are all kinds of new issues that are going to pop up. Putin is going to, I think I said this last week and I'll say it again, there was nothing about Vladimir Putin that suggested that he would become who he would become. He was able to get himself into the mayor's office at St. Petersburg. He started working for a man named Anatoly Sobchak, and we're going to read quite a bit about that. But he did not have visions of himself as being a politician. And it will be interesting to see that transformation as the course of the 1990s progresses. So what we're about to read is, I would say, a particularly dark period in Russian history, but not such a dark period for Vladimir Putin. He's starting to set up exactly what was just described, figuring out how to, as the country transformed itself into something akin to a capitalist country, he was in the right place at the right time to start to understand how to build wealth and massive wealth. And so we'll see that he surrounds himself by these people who are really sharks, and they are going to make money hand over fist. So that's what we will get on to next week. We're going to spend part of the time next week talking about Boris Yeltsin, talking about Anatoly Sobchak, and talking about this transformation of Russia and also Vladimir Putin himself.
Hi,
Thank you all very much. Nice to see you. See you next week. I hope the weather is warmer.
I'm
than-
here. I'll be right there. I was watching a class.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you from Rosina.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.